beer. Sparkling, golden, pure, refreshing. A beverage as old as history.
In Minnesota, beer has been around nearly as long as the state itself. However, in the last 15 years, there's been an explosion of new and different beers to try from small and independent brewers. But it's not just the drinks that make this movement special, it's the culture of the craft.
I enjoy craft beer.
I really like the Pilsners. I really like IPAs.
I turned 21 and we went to a liquor store and I was like, hey man, what's good? I'd been drinking basically Heineken and Guinness. And he was like, here, try this. And he handed me a 4-pack of the Surly Coffee Bender. And that was about it. That's what got me started.
But before we can talk about modern craft beer, we have to go all the way back to 1860. The oldest brewery in Minnesota was started in New Ulm by August Schell, a German immigrant who sought to keep the tradition of German beer alive in his community. Today, August's legacy is continued by his great-great-grandson, Ted Marty, at Schell's.
I don't very often think about it because you're knee-deep into issues half the time and, trying to maintain the brewery, improve the brewery, and so it isn't very often that I wander around and think how cool it really is to be the 5th generation. There's always a little bit of pressure, you don't want to be the slug that loses the brewery, but it is cool. We've kind of gone through the whole history of beer, Obviously when we started, everything was theoretically craft beer because it was all malt, just malt and hops.
Self-proclaimed as Minnesota's original craft brewery, Schell's did a lot to help build the craft beer scene across America.
As that movement started, a lot of people had a great idea for a beer but no brewery, and so we got a lot of those people, especially from the West Coast, because we were the closest brewery that would do anything for somebody on a small scale.
For a brand as old as Schell's, they're still innovating and creating new craft beers as the scene has grown in Minnesota. For the Great State Get-Together, they developed a new blend unlike anything they had brewed before, the Grain Belt Blue.
We really went back to the Radler style. It's a German Radler, and Radler means bicycle in German. And when you're out bicycling in Germany in the mountains and so forth, they didn't really want a heavy beer, and so typically the tavern or the bar would blend half beer, half pop. So it was a lighter flavored beer, and so we sort of took our cue from there and created sort of a blend of blueberry and beer.
In 2002, Schell's bought the historic Grain Belt brand to save it from bankruptcy and keep a Minnesota favorite alive after more than a century of existence.
I liked the idea of buying Grain Belt because it was a historic Minnesota brewery, a lot of the same heritage that we had, and we had capacity here that we could absorb it without, going out, all of a sudden building a brewery twice as big and taking a chance, because historically brands that go downhill, you almost never bring them back up, other than like a Pabst or a Hamm's or something like that, where all of a sudden you're selling $9 30 packs or something like that. Well, small breweries can't make money that way. We just, it's kind of ironic. Everybody thinks when you're small you can make cheap beer. Well, it's just the opposite. The big guys can make cheap beer, the small guys can't.
So you say you like craft beers, brands like Goose Island and Shock Top, or maybe you're higher class and enjoy an import like Stella Artois or Modelo Especial. These brands are owned by Anheuser-Busch, makers of domestic drafts like Budweiser, Bud Light, and Busch. Well, maybe you think you're safe because you drink Leinenkugels from Wisconsin or Blue Moon from Colorado. Well, both of these classics are owned by Miller Coors, famous for the two beers that make up their name. In fact, Anheuser-Busch not only makes the king of beers, but truly sits on a throne, owning nearly half the retail beer market. They're followed by Miller Coors with just over 20%, and the next biggest is Heineken USA with around 5% of the market. Together, they dominate store shelves across America. But even against these giants, craft brewing has come in overnight and taken the beer scene by storm. The Brewers Association represents more than 4,000 small and independent breweries and says the market has been steadily growing, with 842 new breweries opening from 2016 to 2017 and producing 12.3% of all beer sold in America and earning more than $23 billion in sales in that year alone. Even with the accessibility of the larger national brands, many people are switching to craft beer instead.
I hit the Coors Light. I ran into Coors Banquet, which I fell in love with, and I realized very quickly that Coors Banquet was just a stepping stone to all the other opportunities of flavor that beer has to offer, really.
I really like Minnesota's craft brewery scene. I've been out to Colorado a bunch of times, and the craft brew scene is real old there. It doesn't feel quite so homegrown anymore. So I really like how familial it feels here in Minnesota. It's a neat atmosphere.
And I really like the vibes that they all bring, and it's a really cool business.
I'm a big fan because it's sort of a break from the sort of American trend of like really big, really cheap mass production stuff.
Behind every craft brew, there's a story of how it came to be. Many started as hobbies and grew into obsessions. Omar Ansari founded Surly Brewing with his wife Becky in 2006 and has since grown the company into the 49th largest producer of beer in America.
So the point of that story is Becky's the one that built the Minnesota beer scene.
I think anyone that is a home brewer at some point thinks, even for a little bit, it'd be great to turn this hobby into a job. Back in 2004, it didn't seem like there were many options. There were two great homebrew stores in the city. Summit was here, but it never even crossed my mind to open a brewery that just didn't even be wasn't one of the options. Then in 2004, I saw an ad in a homebrew magazine that had a small brewery for sale, really small, and it said, for a bar that wants to add a brew pub or someone like a home brewer gone wild. And I saw it was so tiny and cheap enough. I'm like, well, maybe I could do this, and that's really where it started.
With the explosion of craft brewers comes a need for unique brand names. For Omar, this meant finding something that matched his vision for the future of his new brewery.
When my wife and I were working on the name, which was all we really had to work on for the longest amount of time, we wanted to do something tied into the area, local, because I think breweries are so connected to the areas they're in, but Brooklyn Center Brewing just didn't quite work. There's Brooklyn Brewing in New York and Upper Hennepin County are really close to Minneapolis. Brewing didn't seem to work, so none of those sort of geographic things were a hook. We want to be a little more urban and also have a name we could have some fun with. So my wife and I were talking about ideas, and Surly came up as a possibility, and it seemed like that could be a pretty good launching point for a brewery name and something that could kind of lead to a lot of great beer names.
And when it comes to naming the beers he makes, well, they're just as you'd expect with a brand name like Surly.
The beginning ones were all pretty well tied in: Furious, Bender, Cynical, Cynic Ale, Hell. They all seem to kind of tie right into that ethos of Surly and what that meant. Something we're trying to have some fun with. It's beer, at the end of the day. You don't want to get too over the top with it. So
when Surly brewed its first barrel of beer, it was one of just a handful of independent craft breweries in the state, making it a leader when the floodgates began to open in the coming years.
It feels good to be sort of at the tip of the spear. It made some things harder, some things easier. Now there's so many places to sell craft beer, but there's so many breweries that are doing it. But I hope some of the things we did were good for the Minnesota beer scene. The more craft beer out there, the more it's going to be good for beer drinkers and the beer business. So it's gotten so much, it's so crazy now. But at the end of the day, hopefully we've been a good part of the story of Minnesota beer.
The Third Street Brewhouse is a 6-year-old addition to the Cold Spring Brewing Company that has been around since 1874 in central Minnesota.
I started working here right after I graduated from St. Cloud State. We weren't a craft brewery at the time. I started working here in 2005. We were mainly producing energy drinks and bottled water. We built this brew house in 2012, which is when our craft brand started. The owners wanted to get into the craft industry. We were doing cheaper beers before that. We were doing contract brewing for some other craft breweries, and they really set the stones for us to move forward with making our own brand in the craft industry.
The 3rd Street brand came from their location in downtown Cold Spring, where the brew house was built right on the city's former 3rd Street. When it came to naming their beers, however, the 3rd Street Brewers had a different philosophy than Surly.
Finding a name for a beer is challenging nowadays, so we try to base the name off of more of the flavor profiles of the beer. There's not a specific way of how we do it, but we just do brainstorming and of different ideas, and then when we find one that clicks, then we choose that one.
Craft brewing in Minnesota has both a history as old as the state itself and a modern energy from hundreds of independent brewers and thousands of drinkers who can't get enough of the uniquely Midwestern culture. Oh, and the beer too. But what really is the culture of the craft?
Certainly it's a rejection of sort of the norm of everyday kind of beer. There's a lot of independence in that culture. I don't want somebody else to tell me what I should like. I want to discover it myself. I think those are all trends that have helped.
It's nice to drink a craft beer and get to just talk to people about it and discuss, what you like and what you don't like about it. So it kind of brings everyone together.
The craft industry to me is more drink local, so to push it nationwide is kind of defeating that.
There's really a huge sense of community to it. It's the beer festivals, it's the going to the beer halls, the going to all the events. I think that's a big part of it. So yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's all about the people that are the drinkers and the brewers in the industry.
At least in Minnesota, is sociable, casual, and fun. Simple as that.
Can you tell us a little bit about the peacock story? Because that's hilarious. I don't know if I've heard about peacocks ever being in Minnesota.
Yeah, so a neighbor lived across the river from us here, and she was a stockholder. She passes away, and I think she had maybe four peacocks she kept in a barn. And those relatives didn't know what to do. What do you do with peacocks when you have to clean out their house and so forth? So they asked us, we wanted them, and because we had an old poster, a pre-prohibition non-alcoholic malt poster with this gorgeous lady and a peacock on it, we thought, that's appropriate. We should have peacocks here. And then it was kind of cool because they wandered around and people could feed them, and they make kind of a mess, which is the downside, but they are cool to see walking around. So we've had them for, 1975 or so, something like that. And I know if you get too many around here, they tend to wander, and then, sometimes they'd be missing one, and then you'd get a report here, this house, and then that house, and that house. And